This video is sponsored by Conflict of Nations, the free online strategy game happening in a modern global warfare. Are you prepared to assume command of an entire nation during an intense global conflict? Dive into Conflict of Nations and seize control as you embark on epic real-time battles that can span weeks, pitting you up against up to 125 rival players. Will you unleash tanks, fighter jets, or even submarine-launched nuclear strikes upon your foes? Or perhaps you prefer diplomacy over warfare? With Conflict of Nations, you're the mastermind behind the strategy, deciding whether to confront other players as adversaries or forge powerful alliances to conquer the world side by side. As the nation's leader, you have to expertly manage everything, from economics to technological research, since modern warfare is as much about logistical prowess as it is about tactical brilliance. Infographics show viewers get a special gift of 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free when they use the link, but it's only available for 30 days, so don't wait. Click the link, choose a country, and start fighting your way to victory right now. One of the scariest things about World War III is how quickly it could start. Could something as simple as a line of computer code, a few wrong words, or an unpopular decision lead to a global conflict? In this video, we will not be making predictions or telling you how the future will unfold. Instead, you'll be presented with facts and data about the catalysts for World War III. Then we'll present a thought-provoking analysis of each factor, consequence, and solution that may result from such a conflict. Before we dive into the meat of this analysis, we need to identify the possible triggers that could start World War III. The overall themes of this section are transferable across time, so even if major powers can somehow keep a conflict from erupting, this analysis will be useful in the future. We'll look at each of the triggers using current events as case studies. Some of the causes of World War III will likely be pretty obvious, but others might be elements lurking just under the radar. To best prevent a global conflict from breaking out and threatening humanity's existence, we must understand what we're dealing with. Trigger number 1. Regional conflicts. We know that the war in Ukraine has been covered extensively, but there is important reason for that. What Vladimir Putin is doing in Eastern Europe could very well be a catalyst for World War III. It's important to note that back in February 2022, when Russian troops invaded Ukraine, the world was on a high alert, and it seemed like we were about to be plunged into a global war. We should never forget the lead up to and the prolonged fighting that's still happening in Ukraine, and it's important to remember how we got here for our analysis later on. Vladimir Putin was an authoritarian leader that much of the world was afraid to stand up to. This meant that there were very few consequences when he annexed Crimea from Ukraine in 2016. Therefore, it's not surprising that when he decided to invade the rest of Ukraine in 2022, Putin went into the battle thinking he'd be able to quickly capture Kyiv, subjugate the Ukrainian people, and then wait out the sanctions that would inevitably be imposed on his country. Obviously, this is not how things turned out, but Putin is still in power and he's still very dangerous. The reason why the Russian dictator still clings to power has a lot to do with how the government and society in Russia are structured. We're not here to deep dive into the brutal tactics Putin and his regime use to oppress the people of Russia, but it's important to know that he controls the narrative around what is happening in Ukraine and abroad. Therefore, for the most part, many Russians are either still willing to support Putin's decisions or are too afraid to speak out. What all of this means is that even though Ukraine has pushed Russian forces out of most of their country, this regional conflict could still escalate into something much worse. Every day the Russian military doesn't make progress in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin appears weak. In order for an authoritarian ruler to maintain power, he cannot look weak to his people or the world. However, with Western powers sending massive amounts of military equipment and aid to Ukraine, and Finland joining NATO, it is very clear that the West no longer fears Russia. This could drive Putin to take drastic actions to reclaim some kind of forward momentum in the war and reassert his power. For a while, Putin threatened to use nuclear weapons, but that was mainly just posturing on his part. However, if Putin does become backed into a corner, either by the West or his own people, there's no telling how far he'll go to try to keep his power. Russia has more nuclear weapons than any other country on the planet, and if Putin is given the option of annihilating his enemies with nukes or being removed from power, it's not out of the realm of possibility that he'll take drastic measures. Then there are other weapons that Putin could try to use to defeat Ukrainian forces, some of which could elicit an immediate response from the international community. If Russia started using chemical or biological weapons against Ukrainian troops, it would breach numerous international laws and would likely cause other world powers to intervene. We already know that Putin isn't afraid to make his country suffer under harsh sanctions, so placing even more restrictions on Russia if Putin uses chemical or biological weapons probably wouldn't stop him. This might force NATO to declare war on Russia, and in this particular circumstance, some countries might ally themselves with Putin if this happens. Make no mistake, Vladimir Putin, the Russian military, and the mercenaries hired by the government have all committed war crimes. However, killing massive amounts of people using illegal weapons could be the final straw that pushes the West over the edge and forces them to declare war on Russia, launching us into World War III. Then there's the possibility that an accident or a series of unfortunate events leads to a Russian attack or military strike on NATO targets. With the addition of Finland, NATO's border with Russia has now more than doubled in length. This could increase the chances of an accident or deliberate sabotage occurring in the region. If Russia ever attacked a NATO territory, it would inevitably lead to World War III. The scary thing is that if a minor conflict broke out between Russia and NATO soldiers, either due to a misunderstanding or the actions of a group of rogue soldiers, the consequences could be disastrous. Russia could claim that NATO provoked them, causing China to back one of its closest allies. A small incident between Russia and NATO could quickly snowball out of control and lead to World War III. But the war between Russia and Ukraine isn't the only regional conflict that could escalate to world war. For now, China's threatened any nation that does business with Taiwan or recognizes the island as a sovereign nation. This is because the Chinese government claims that Taiwan is actually a part of China and under Beijing's control. This is similar to the reasoning that Vladimir Putin used for invading Ukraine. Regardless of how Beijing feels, much of the world agrees Taiwan is its own country, including the United States. In fact, President Joe Biden said that it would come to Taiwan's aid if China ever became militarily hostile. So, the regional conflict between Taiwan and China could pull the other major powers and result in a much larger conflict. Past events, such as the Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taipei and the willingness of other Western officials to disregard China's warnings around interacting with the Taiwanese government, may actually push Beijing to take action. It's kind of like poking a bear. You might get away with it for a while, but eventually the bear will come after you. China is an economic powerhouse that's been spreading its influence around the world over the past few decades. In fact, many countries' economies heavily rely on Chinese trade. China can use this power to gather allies or sway the opinions of different governments in its favor. The Chinese military might not be able to compete with the US, but its economic influence could bring the global markets to their knees. If the West continues instigating China by strengthening its ties to Taiwan, President Xi Jinping could end up retaliating. If China ever did decide to invade Taiwan, it would need to amass a huge military force along the Taiwan Strait. This mobilization would quickly be spotted, and diplomatic talks would likely ensue. China and the United States do not want to go to war with each other because the result would have catastrophic consequences for both countries, the global economy, and international relations as a whole. Not to mention that a conflict between China and the US would likely drag allies from both sides into a war, which would result in World War III. Then there's the regional conflict on the Korean Peninsula. The craziest thing is that North and South Korea are technically still at war with one another. The Korean Armistice Agreement stopped the fighting of the Korean War, but since no peace treaty was ever signed, the two countries are still fighting. Regardless of this unbelievable fact, tensions between the governments in Seoul and Pyongyang have increased. This has a lot to do with Kim Jong-un's divisive rhetoric against the West and its allies, of which South Korea is one of the most important in the region. This back and forth between the governments has not led to an armed conflict yet, but close allies of both countries are keeping an eye on the situation. China has continuously backed North Korea, while the US has extremely close ties to South Korea. But again, what is important to remember in all of these conflicts is that we no longer live in an isolated world. A major war between two nations inevitably comes with allies who are willing to back one side or the other. And even if major world powers don't go to war with one another as a direct result of a regional conflict, it does lead to weapons and military aid being sent to both sides, leading to more death and destruction. As regional conflicts get increasingly out of control, it seems it's only a matter of time before larger powers step in and incite a global conflict that could result in World War III. Trigger number 2. Cyber warfare. The world is becoming more and more digital. The internet is now the backbone of many financial, military, and government organizations. Even though sensitive information and classified data might be protected behind firewalls and anti-hacker programming, we've seen time and time again that someone always finds a way around those defenses. World War III might not start with troops fighting one another face-to-face or a disagreement between politicians. In fact, World War III might not even start in the material world. Instead, a global conflict might arise due to digital information being stolen, elections being rigged, or hackers taking over a country's military arsenal. AI, or artificial intelligence, has been in the news a lot recently. This emerging tech has been declared both a marvel and a scourge on humanity. Many of the current AI systems regurgitate information that sounds good but is full of blatant lies. Other programs have been found to use sensitive user information in responses to other people's prompts. Many companies are now either forbidding employees to use certain AI platforms or restricting the information that can be put into them. However, the AI of the future might pose the biggest threat to humanity and lead to World War III. We're not trying to create a Skynet scenario where Terminators take over the planet. Instead, we're talking about the fact that major defense companies like Rand Corporation have said AI will have a large effect on nuclear security issues in the next quarter century. Whether you like AI or not, there is something eerie about having a computer-based intelligence in charge of nuclear weapons. What companies like Rand are talking about is that AI can be used to make more informed decisions, track enemy missiles, or launch countermeasures quicker than humans can. However, this also brings up the possibility of hackers taking advantage of the AI and wreaking havoc on military systems. This could theoretically be used to launch missiles inadvertently or deactivate weapon systems to cripple the retaliatory strike capabilities. What it comes down to is that if vital military or government systems were ever found to be hacked by a foreign power, it could lead to World War III. No government's going to sit idly by while cyber warfare is waged against them. And if they can't stop the hackers via computers and the internet, there's a good chance they'll stop them using force. Cyber warfare might also be used to destabilize a nation's infrastructure or energy systems. We now live in a world where hackers can do a lot of things that conventional soldiers used to do. Entire cities can be shut down by bad actors, taking control of a power grid. Military satellites and computer networks can be hijacked or exploited by an enemy. A foreign power can manipulate people's perceptions to turn the populace against their own government. These are all scenarios that could lead to one major power attacking another to regain control of the situation. At the very least, if cyber warfare doesn't start World War III, it will certainly play a role in the conflict itself. Militaries will use cyber warfare to deactivate or scramble an enemy's command system, or early warning and logistics systems could be hacked to allow for a more successful attack. As technology advances, more and more conflicts might arise due to cyber warfare, the culmination of which could be the beginning of World War III. Trigger number 3. Nuclear proliferation. With everything that's going on in the world, most of the talk around nuclear weapons has to do with their use in turning the tide of a regional conflict or ending the world. However, there's a much bigger problem that we should be concerned about, one that could directly lead to World War III. Nuclear proliferation is the spread of nuclear weapons technology, or fissile material to countries that do not already possess them. In 1970, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons was first enforced. Then, on May 11, 1995, the treaty was extended indefinitely. This agreement keeps any nation that possesses nuclear capabilities from supplying other countries that do not have nuclear capabilities with nuclear materials. This was to prevent more countries from gaining access to destructive weapons that could end the world and therefore, hopefully, reduce the chances that they would be used. However, there are some loopholes in the agreement that have been exploited. One example of a country taking advantage of the Non-Proliferation Treaty was in 2021, when the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia entered into the AUKUS Pact that would eventually provide Australia, a non-nuclear state, with nuclear-powered submarines. The loophole that the US and UK exploited was that nuclear materials can be given to a non-nuclear state for use in nuclear-powered ships. It's been generally agreed upon submarines technically fall into this section of the agreement, but the fact that by their very nature nuclear-powered submarines cannot be inspected by the International Atomic Energy Agency at any given time means that this is a slippery slope to go down. Theoretically, Australian scientists could siphon off radioactive material from the cores of the nuclear-powered subs and use it to conduct experiments and even develop their own nuclear weapons. We're not saying that this is what Australia will do, but it's one of the reasons that the IAEA requires nuclear reactors of all kinds to be inspected and that all nuclear materials be accounted for. So, what the United States and the UK are doing in this agreement is technically nuclear proliferation. Obviously, China is incredibly upset about this turn of events because Australia having nuclear-powered subs will allow them to patrol the Indian and Pacific Oceans more effectively and conduct stealth operations. But even as China voices its displeasure, the agreement seems to be going forward. The AUKUS agreement sets a dangerous precedent. What if China starts providing other authoritarian leaders or unstable governments with nuclear-powered submarines? What if Myanmar or Venezuela signed an agreement with China for nuclear-powered subs? Beijing could cite the AUKUS agreement as grounds to go through with the deals. This all seems unlikely at the moment, but in the future, as China gains more influence around the world, who knows what type of alliances will arise. One thing is for sure, the more countries with nuclear weapons, the greater the chance humanity will blow itself up if World War III breaks out. Then there's the fact that one country might just sell nuclear weapons to another, even though it would be in direct violation of the treaty. But here's the thing. Although the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons has been signed by all nuclear powers, there are no real repercussions for breaking the agreement. Yes, there would likely be sanctions, but the body put in place to enforce the treaty is made up of the countries that already have nuclear weapons. So if one country breaks the Non-Proliferation Pact, they might be sanctioned by the others, but there's nothing to actually stop them from selling nuclear weapons. Although the alternative is that some countries might declare war on the seller and kick off World War III. The one thing that the world does have going for it in this situation is that no leader wants nuclear war, which has the potential to end civilization as we know it. Instead, many of the nations with nuclear weapons have promised to reduce the amount they hold in stock. This would definitely be a step in the right direction if everyone was doing this. Unfortunately, right now, several countries are actually increasing the number of operational nukes in their arsenals. China, India, North Korea, Pakistan, and the United Kingdom all seem to be increasing their stockpiles, while the US and Russia have already enough nukes to blow up every major city on the planet many times over. So if nuclear proliferation doesn't lead to World War III, the stockpiling of nuclear weapons by nations that already have nukes could end the world regardless. Trigger number 4. Resource competition. There's a misconception that overpopulation of the planet is what's causing the depletion of resources. This is not entirely true. There's no denying that the more people there are on Earth, the more resources will be needed. However, the current population is not large enough to consume all the resources on the planet. Instead, it's the overconsumption by certain nations and populations that have had a disastrous impact on our natural resources. Trees being cut down in rainforests aren't being used by the inhabitants of the Amazon. They're being shipped to the United States, Europe, China, and other wealthy nations. The destruction of biodiverse ecosystems to make room for palm oil farms and monocultures isn't to feed the population in that country. It's done to ship food and resources to nations with wealthier consumer bases. In fact, many resources aren't even being fought over because they're a necessity. They're being fought over because they are lucrative. Gold mines, fossil fuels, and metals are not resources that people need. They're resources that governments and businesses want. So resource competition is not about survival, it's about making money. And when money is involved, the conflict is not too far behind. It's not hard to imagine a future where fossil fuels, especially oil, cause wars. Right now, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, controls how much oil is exported from the most petroleum-rich nations in the world, and therefore pretty much controls the price of oil. Most of the world's economies run off of fossil fuels, and as supplies diminish, wars will be fought over who has access to the resources. The alternatives is that nations start moving toward more sustainable forms of energy, but this seems to be a slow process and one that not everyone's interested in pursuing. Therefore, nations such as China, the United States, Russia, Japan, and most of the EU will need to find ways to power their economies with fewer fossil fuels. That being said, countries with developing economies will actually rely even more on fossil fuels in the future than they do now, as they try to catch up to other major economic powers. This means these nations could see more conflict, as the battle for fossil fuels is waged across the planet, resulting in a World War III resource war. It should also be noted that overconsumption has led to the depletion of vital freshwater resources in places like the western United States and parts of China. These are national problems that could have international consequences. For example, the Colorado River, which runs into Mexico, carries less and less water to its terminus every year. This means that water supplies that northwestern Mexico has always relied on are becoming scarcer as the Colorado River runs dry. This is just one of the many examples of the industrial practices of one nation affecting another. Will Mexico end up going to war with the United States over water use? Probably not. Is it something that could cause conflict in the future? Absolutely. This serves as a warning that something as important as fresh water isn't just a resource that people want, it's a resource people need. Conflicts will arise as more rivers and freshwater sources are depleted or polluted. Will there be water wars that result in World War III breaking out? It doesn't appear so yet, but unless humans take protecting the planet and its resources more seriously and work toward reducing overconsumption, resource wars of the future might be the norm and could lead to a global conflict where everyone takes a side. Trigger number 5. Differences in ideologies. In 2023, there are two major factions on the global stage. They are the Western democratic republics that include the United States, the United Kingdom, and the European Union. Then there are the authoritarian or single-party governments like China and Russia and North Korea. Obviously, other nations can fall into these two categories, and some countries have governments that straddle the line between the two, but what it comes down to is there is a fundamental difference between each form of government. In Western democracies, politicians are kept in check by the public for the most part through somewhat fair and open elections. No country is perfect, and there are plenty of societal issues in the West that impede certain populations from voting or that sway votes in favor of certain parties or candidates. But the key here is that the people have a say in their government. In countries under authoritarian rule, the population has very little say or no say in how the countries run or the decisions the government makes. When we zoom out to the world scale, we see that Western democracies ally with one another, while authoritarians form close ties to other authoritarian leaders. This is because authoritarian leaders share the same ideals and principles, and more because they have the same goal: to hold onto power at all costs and not let Western democracies influence their populations to reform the systems currently in place. This is why Russia and China are so adamant about keeping Western influence away from their borders. Authoritarians cannot allow the general population to have too much freedom, or it could lead to revolution. Regardless of which system a country has, every government acts on its own interest. This is why the United States presses its own culture and ideals upon other nations around the world, and why China does the same thing. They do this in different ways, but both nations use their economic and military capabilities to get what they want. However, the two political ideologies will likely never be able to get along. There are many reasons for this, but the main one is that neither wants to give up their power. Authoritarian regimes want to remain in control of their people at all costs. In China's case, the current government wants to both control its people and spread its influence throughout the world. Western democracies claim they're trying to create a free world where citizens of a country have a say in their government. This would be ideal, but the way this is done doesn't always have the people's best interests in mind. For example, all you have to do is look at the quick collapse of the Afghanistan government once the US left, as it fell under control of the Taliban. The US claimed it was there to free the Afghan people, but after years of fighting, they're right back where they started. The divide in political and social ideologies has driven a wedge between the West and the authoritarian-controlled nations like Russia and China. Beijing and Moscow claim that a lot of the aggressive stances they take are to stop the encroachment of Western principles closer to their borders. In fact, Putin claimed that one of the reasons he invaded Ukraine was to stop NATO forces from getting closer to Russia. China continually declares the United States in particular is forcing its ideologies onto other nations in East and Southeast Asia. And to be fair, this is partly true. Both the West and the authoritarian regimes around the world believe their way of running the country is superior, and this very difference between the two systems and the spread of influence could result in World War III. Now that we know what could cause World War III, let's look at some of the consequences this global war could have. Military consequences. As was briefly mentioned before, technology is advancing. In terms of weapons, this means they're becoming more deadly. World War III would be, by far, the bloodiest and most devastating conflict this planet has ever seen. Humans now have the ability to launch missiles across entire continents and oceans to hit targets with relative precision. Stealth aircraft and nuclear submarines can infiltrate enemy borders and attack key targets without ever being spotted. Satellites and surveillance craft can gather intelligence from across the globe and relay it directly back to a command center. Basically, if World War III breaks out, there would be nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The war would be fought on land, in the sea, in the skies, and in space. New tech is being created every few years to allow militaries to be more deadly. Hypersonic missiles that travel 5 times the speed of sound will be impossible to intercept. Aircraft carriers will serve as floating fortresses to send forces across the globe. Drones will strike the enemy without putting human pilots in harm's way. All of the advanced tech that countries display to show the rest of the world how powerful they are will be unleashed. The war in Ukraine is just a small taste of how devastating World War III will be. Ukrainian troops receive powerful weapons from other Western nations, but the best of the best is being held back, just in case a global conflict arises. In World War III, there will be no holding back. Everything will be unleashed, and whichever side finds itself on the losing end will more than likely resort to using nukes to even the odds. Because when nuclear weapons come into play, there are no winners. Political consequences. World War III won't just be about who has the most missiles or best weapons, it'll also be a political game of chess. Defense pacts will be upheld, and new political alliances will be formed. The largest and most powerful alliance in the world is NATO. Any world war of the future will be between this strategic alliance and whoever's on the other side. However, if World War III started, there's a good chance even non-NATO members would form some kind of alliance. Japan, South Korea, and Australia would likely all ally themselves with NATO countries and form closer ties to the US and the EU. However, the other side of the fight might hold some surprising new political alliances. China's become much more influential in Latin America recently, while the United States focused its attention on the Middle East for the past 2 decades. China's been forming political ties, making trade deals, and investing heavily in Latin America. Many countries in South America are now more reliant on China than the United States. And as Beijing increases its control over Latin American governments and begins to shift the perception of the Latin American people toward favoring China, it could lead to some pretty shocking partnerships. Emerging economies in Africa and South Asia rely heavily on China for investments and resources. These countries would be faced with the terrible decision of either allying with China in World War III or facing economic collapse. Then there's the fact that any nation that doesn't ally itself with China in a global conflict will likely find itself invaded by the largest army in the world. There are over 2 million active service members in China right now, which is almost double the number the US has. But we know that having a large military doesn't necessarily mean a country can win a war. This is why no matter who goes up against NATO, they'll need to form alliances with countries that can provide them with soldiers, weapons, and resources. If the world is still around after a global conflict, the borders of the losing countries will almost certainly change. Whichever side wins will reshape the planet in its image. If Western democracies come out on top, authoritarian regimes will likely be overthrown either through military force or by popular revolutions. If the authoritarian regimes end up winning, democracy would be dismantled and dictators would rule the world. The political ramifications of World War III are unpredictable, but there is little doubt that after a global conflict, many parts of the world would need to start all over again. New governments would be put in place. Huge amounts of humanitarian aid would need to be sent to war-ravaged parts of the planet. Again, the problem with World War III is that we now have enough weapons to pretty much wipe humanity off the face of the earth. So, although borders and political allegiances might shift during or after the conflict, there would likely be little left to save, as parts of the landscape might be irradiated and the global population would be cut by billions. Economic consequences. In the past, war has tended to be good for an economy. When wartime production begins ramping up, huge amounts of money and resources are poured into various industries. Countries with large manufacturing capabilities are able to build more weapons and machinery that they can then sell to other nations that'll need them. However, World War III would be different. Since we live in a global economy where the markets are intertwined and the economy of one nation can have drastic impacts on others, World War III would likely send every economy into chaos. When a war is far from home, the damage to markets can be mitigated. However, if every major power was part of a war, there would be no way to protect the global economy. The first shock would come when people started pulling their money out of the stock market as the future became uncertain. Then banks would begin to collapse as citizens tried to withdraw their money and escape to relative safety. Trade would either stop or be refocused to only include allied nations. Right now, China and the United States are each other's largest trading partners. In a global conflict, China would likely find itself cut off from markets in the US and the EU. They would then begin to rely only on other nations to provide them with the resources they needed. But money from exports would be drastically reduced. The US and other Western countries would develop huge supply chain issues as they can no longer procure cheap goods from China or use its manufacturing centers. There might be a move to nationalize production in various countries, but we have created so much reliance between different parts of the world as a result of global trade that this change would happen very slowly. It would also likely fail as certain components would be incredibly hard to come by. Taiwan produces over 60% of all semiconductors and close to 90% of the most advanced semiconductors in the world. Whoever controls Taiwan in World War III will have a huge advantage when constructing anything with electronics, including advanced weapons. There is very little chance that Taiwan would remain independent in World War III, as it would likely be one of China's first targets. But if it could remain neutral, Taiwan's economy would explode. However, the rest of the world would likely find their economies in shambles until the war ended. And even after that, the infrastructure of many nations would be decimated, and it would take decades to recover. Although perhaps out of the ashes of World War III, a more cooperative global economy would emerge that focuses on getting people the resources and goods they need to rebuild and make the world a better place for everyone to live in. But this is probably just wishful thinking. Social consequences. As mentioned before, there will be no escaping World War III. Of course, some areas will be less affected than others, but at the very least, the aftermath of the conflict will be felt in every corner of the globe. The most likely scenario will put the territories of the US, Europe, Russia, and China at the most risk. This also means the people living in those parts of the world are in the most danger when it comes to being displaced by the fighting. In World War III, there is little doubt that the destruction would reach the shores of the United States. This will be the first time a major attack is conducted against the continental US in over a century. It's important to remember that Europe, Russia, and even China were devastated by World War II and had to rebuild. The populations in these areas were decimated, but the US, on the other hand, has never had its lands completely ravished by war. This does not mean World War III would be any easier for other parts of the world than in the US. It just means that this global conflict will cause a humanitarian crisis on a scale that has never been seen before. Large percentages of each country's population will be in some way involved in the war, either by fighting as soldiers or manufacturing components for equipment and weapons. Therefore, everyone will be a target. In World War III, countries will have the capability to launch air and missile strikes from across the planet. Civilian populations working in factories or important industries will be vulnerable. World War III will likely result in more casualties than any other war in human history, a large portion of which will be non-military personnel. The bulk of the land fighting will likely happen on the European and Asian continents, which could result in a mass exodus of refugees to other parts of the world. Europeans might seek safety in Canada or Africa, while Russian and Chinese citizens might flee further north, away from the main fighting, or across the Pacific to Latin America. If somehow the human species survives World War III, entire cities will lie in ruin. The rebuilding of urban centers will cost unfathomable amounts of money. There might be a mass exodus of people out of major population hubs into more rural areas where they will stay, as the risk of dying would be somewhat reduced. After World War III, the population of many countries will be drastically diminished, and a large majority of their citizens will likely be displaced across the planet. Countries that have some of the largest populations today, like China, India, and the United States, will be little more than a shadow of what they once were. World War III will more than likely have casualties in the hundreds of millions, if not the billions. However, regions of the planet, like parts of Africa and South America, that could see less death and destruction could become much more influential in a post-World War III world. Their infrastructure and manufacturing sectors might be spared, and their populations may only suffer minimal loss. This will allow societies in these parts of the world to rebuild faster, maybe even lend aid to nations that have been annihilated by the war. As we all know, one byproduct of war is almost always human rights violations. There will be trauma that needs to be dealt with in the aftermath of World War III. The remainder of the people on the planet will suffer from PTSD due to the destruction of their homes, cities, and countries. There will undoubtedly be a commission set up when the war ends by the victors to condemn the enemy for using inhumane tactics while trying to hide any atrocities that its own soldiers committed during the war. World War III will not be pretty. A large amount of the world's population will die or be displaced as refugees. There will be cries for reparations and justice if peace is ever reached. Environmental consequences. The state of the planet in the aftermath of World War III will be shaped by the types of weapons used in the conflict. If the worst were to happen and nuclear weapons detonate across the planet, Earth would likely go into a nuclear winter. This means the amount of debris, smoke, and dust ejected into the atmosphere by nuclear detonations will block enough of the sun's radiation that the global temperature will fall. The temperature change might be only a few degrees, or it could be a decrease of several degrees. Either way, it'll have consequences that will lead to even more death. In a nuclear winter, many plants won't receive enough sunlight to grow. Entire fields will remain fallow, and our main source of sustenance will quickly run out. Entire forests and ecosystems will collapse. Nuclear winter would cause a mass extinction, leaving only a fraction of the species on Earth alive. Humans might be able to survive nuclear winter in bunkers and by using hydroponics and other alternative growing methods for food. However, the majority of the human population would starve to death. Then there's the fact that large amounts of land would be irradiated for years. Radiation would also be carried across the planet as particles from the detonations are swept to far-off places by the wind. In these areas, nothing would grow. Water would be contaminated, and anyone in the vicinity would suffer from radiation poisoning. It would be a truly apocalyptic event. However, even if nukes weren't used, the destruction of vital ecosystems and natural resources would be immense. Conventional warfare will result in uncontrollable fires, polluted waters, and infertile land, not to mention the vast amount of resources that would be harvested throughout the war to build up militaries. Mining operations would destroy entire mountains to access ore and other minerals. Drilling rigs would pop up across the planet to extract oil and natural gas from deep within the earth. Greenhouse gas emissions would skyrocket as factories churn out vehicles and weapons. The climate crisis we face today would be exacerbated tenfold. So even if the planet doesn't go into nuclear winter, the climate will still change drastically. This leads us to the question, is there anything we can do to stop the doomsday of World War III? And thankfully, the answer is yes. Let's examine how all of the horrors just discussed could be avoided. The first action that should be taken before any conflict arises between governments are diplomatic talks. It might seem like talking out problems seems like an easy solution, but due to differing social and political solution, it can often be easier said than done. However, diplomatic talks will inevitably need to play a role if we ever hope to avoid World War III. Governments must find common ground, and mutually beneficial relationships need to be forged. We live in a divided world. In order to keep relative peace, there needs to be a delicate balancing act. Global organizations like the UN could be more effective if they were given more authority when it comes to enforcing global norms and punishing bad actors. Obviously, this is a complicated issue, but if an international set of rules were put in place around aggression, human rights, and unethical practices that were enforced by every nation on the planet, it might keep some governments from committing heinous acts like invading their neighbors or committing genocide. Again, this would not be easy, and there would inevitably be a conflict. But if these conflicts could be dealt with diplomatically, it could save the world from World War III. Another problem that's been on the rise and could lead to a global conflict is hyper-nationalism. The thought that one country is the best and everyone should look and act like them is a slippery slope to go down, as we learned from Nazi Germany in World War II. Let's take a look at the US and China, for example. Both want to be superpowers. The United States is currently the only global superpower, but China is expanding its power and influence to reach the same level as the US. The problem is that both governments have radically different ideologies and want the rest of the world to follow their example. This means that when trying to engage in diplomatic talks, neither wants to make concessions or admit that perhaps there are other ways of doing things. Now, we aren't saying that either government is perfect, far from it. What we are saying is that diplomacy will only work if both sides, regardless of who they are, get off their high horses and are willing to have an honest conversation. It would also be helpful if diplomatic discussions happened with experts in the room. Sociologists, anthropologists, economists, scientists, etc. all have valuable insights that could make diplomatic processes more effective. Having a handful of politicians or military leaders negotiating behind closed doors is not a recipe for a common ground. Having a diverse group of experts with data, open minds, and a desire to make the world better and a safer place would be much more effective. So perhaps the best way to keep the planet from being plunged into World War III is by fundamentally changing the way diplomatic talks are carried out. Then, of course, sanctions and military actions could be taken to prevent a conflict from escalating into World War III. Since World War II, the tactics and alliances used to deter one side from becoming too powerful have successfully kept all-out war from breaking out. There have been setbacks and there are definitely regional conflicts, but nukes have not been launched and alliances have not gone to war. The status quo has seemed to work for decades, so why change it now? The problem is the world itself is changing. Social norms are shifting. We now live in a global community where people can travel pretty much anywhere in the world in a matter of hours or days. This should mean we feel closer to one another since every human has more in common than different. However, due to increasing nationalist rhetoric and government leaders who don't always have their people's best interests at heart, the world seems to be becoming more divided than unified. Is World War III inevitable? Kinda depends on who you ask, but there seems to be experts on both sides of the argument. Between regional conflicts, nuclear proliferation, and resource procurement, we appear to have headed toward global conflict. However, we know the devastating social, economic, and environmental impact World War III would have. The vast majority of the planet would be consumed by war, and countless lives would be lost. Our best hope now is to find solutions to common problems, instead of alienating other countries and cultures. Can this be done? Only through a lot of difficult discussions and by actually listening to what other people have to say. If the future of the planet is left in the hands of just a few government leaders who want to increase their power and influence, the world will inevitably end up going to war. There are no easy solutions, but the trajectory we're currently on could end very badly for us all. Thanks again to our sponsor, Conflict of Nations, the free online PvP strategy game happening in a modern global warfare. Get a special gift of 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free by using the link. It's only available for 30 days, so don't wait. Choose your country and start fighting your way to victory right now. Now watch US World War III plan, or check out countries that will be destroyed because of World War III.